I should have let the town take me that night. But the moment his broken hands reached for my child, I knew I'd burn in hell before I ran again. Ruth Winslow stood in the center of Stillwater Square, the baby pressed tight to her chest, as Grant McCoy, the millionaire rancher they called cursed, faced a crowd hungry for judgment. Snow knifed sideways. The church bell tolled like a verdict. Behind them lay the ranch that felt more like a grave, its 2 plates, its shuttered rooms, its Bible marked by another woman's handwriting. Ahead of them waited 3 ticking clocks, the storm that had nearly taken the child, the sickness still humming in her ribs, and the town sharpening its teeth around a lie Warren Kent had paid for in whispers. Grant opened Anna's Bible with bandaged hands, the same hands frostbitten from riding through a blizzard to fetch medicine for a baby that wasn't his. He could barely hold the pages. He read anyway, because by sundown he would either stand for Ruth or lose everything the dead had left him, the land, the name, the memory he guarded like a wound. And Ruth, she had one secret folded in oilcloth that could save them both, or destroy him before dawn. I didn't know then that choosing him would cost me my freedom, and I didn't know choosing me would cost him far more. What neither of them saw in that moment was the rider watching from the tree line, waiting to strike once they walked home as a family. Her knees hit the frozen road before she even knew she'd fallen. Wind shrieked across the empty crossing, blowing snow sideways, cutting her skin open like paper. Ruth Winslow dragged her child tighter under her coat, chin pressed to the tiny forehead to feel for breath. Nothing but a weak, rattling flutter. Lord, not tonight. The whisper wasn't a prayer so much as a reflex, one last muscle still remembering belief. Hope's small hand had gone stiff. Ruth rubbed it fast, until color returned. She couldn't feel her own fingers anymore. The world spun white. 4 roads split around her, all leading to the same end. She told herself to get up. Her legs refused. A horse stopped behind her. Not close, not helpful, just watching. The rider's shadow cut through the storm before the man did. Broad shoulders, a coat heavy with snow. He didn't speak right away, didn't dismount. Ruth didn't lift her head. Pride had frozen long before her body did. What are you willing to trade for another hour alive? His voice was low, sharp, the kind that made weaker souls confess things best left buried. She stiffened. Not that, she managed, breath breaking. Never that. A quiet pause. Good, he said. I wasn't asking for it. Ruth let a thin breath escape, half relief, half grief. I thought he would. The man leaned finally, studying the child, brushing frost off the girl's cheek with a gloved thumb. She's freezing from the inside out, he said. If we don't get a fire under her in 20 minutes, you'll be burying her at dawn. I know. Her lips barely moved. Stand, he ordered. I can't. Then hold on. He slid an arm under hers and hauled her upright, not gently. Efficiency had no room for gentleness. Snow stung her eyes as he lifted Hope from her, settling the baby against his chest, shielding her from the wind with his coat. Ruth swayed, dizzy. The man caught her elbow. "Name?" he asked. "Ruth." "Ruth what?" "Ruth Winslow." He paused again. The name meant something, or maybe he already knew it. The West was wide, but talk traveled faster than any horse. "I'm not riding past a child," he said, "but I don't take in strangers for charity. You work. You follow rules. You don't run when townfolk start talking. Understand?" She pressed her cracked mouth together. She had run from 3 towns already. None had left her a place to kneel, much less stand. "I'll work," she said. "Just save her." He nodded once. No praise. No comfort. He boosted Ruth onto the saddle first, then placed Hope in her arms and swung up behind them. His coat fell around all 3, sealing in what little warmth remained. The horse moved, hooves thudding through drifts. The storm swallowed them whole. Ruth tried to look over her shoulder at the man. She saw only the hard line of his jaw, dusted white with frost, eyes narrowed against the wind. Resolve more than mercy, strength more than softness. She wondered what kind of man rode alone on Christmas week, in a storm that made wolves hide. Someone running from something, she thought. Same as me. A gust hit them sideways. She nearly slipped. His arm tightened around her waist. "Sit still. I'm trying. Try harder." His harshness steadied her more than kindness could have. Snow clung to her lashes until the world blurred. Hope whimpered. Ruth lowered her mouth to the child's ear. "Hold on, little bird. He's getting us somewhere warm." The rider glanced down at that. Not at Ruth. At the child. "She your only?" "Yes." "And her father?" "Gone." He didn't ask anything else. Didn't offer apology or pity. Just drove the horse faster. The wind howled through the cottonwoods like a congregation mourning. Somewhere beneath the noise, Ruth thought she heard church bells. Memory, not sound. Her mother lighting candles on cold December nights. Her father saying the Lord never lost track of wanderers. But the road had lost track of her. The rider leaned forward. "Cabin's close." "How close?" she asked. "Close enough if you don't faint." Her vision tunneled, black at the edges. The saddle lurched. She felt herself tipping forward. A gloved hand snapped to the back of her coat, hauling her upright. "Not yet," he growled. "Not tonight." Her breath shook. Hope whimpered again. And Ruth, cold, starved, bone-tired Ruth, shut her eyes and let a stranger carry God's last chance for her child through the storm. The cabin door shook as the rider kicked it open with the side of his boot. Wind blasted in behind them, scattering frost across the floorboards. He shoved Ruth inside first, then swept in with Hope cradled tight against his chest. "Sit," he ordered. Ruth dropped to her knees beside the cold stove. She could barely feel her legs. The man shed his gloves, struck flint once, twice, sparks catching on tinder as if the Lord himself pushed them. Flame crawled, then roared, Hope's breathing shifted, thin but present. Ruth pressed her ear to the child's chest. "Thank you. Just let her stay." The rider knelt, grabbed a kettle, packed it with snow, set it over the flame. He moved with the cold discipline of a man who'd saved lives before, or lost them too late. "Drink when it melts," he said. "Slow. You'll choke otherwise." Ruth nodded. Her hands shook so hard the floor blurred beneath her. He studied her a long beat. "You said you'd work. Remember that." "I will." "You follow rules?" "Yes." "Then rule 1, he said, lowering himself onto a crate opposite her. "You don't ask where we're going after tonight." "We're not staying here?" "This is a line shack, a stop, nothing more." She brushed frost from Hope's eyebrows. "Rule 2?" she asked. He didn't look away from the stove. "You keep your mouth shut when the town starts talking. They always talk." Ruth swallowed. The same warning had followed her across 3 counties, wearing a different voice each time. "About you or about me?" "Both." The kettle hissed softly. He poured water into a tin cup and slid it toward her with 2 fingers. Ruth sipped. Heat hit her throat like fire, burning its way down to a hollow she'd forgotten was there. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." She stiffened. "What do they say about you?" "That I'm cursed." His tone didn't change. "That everything I touch dies." Ruth went still. Outside, the wind scraped across the roof, a long, slow moan like something mourning. She wanted to tell him lies don't stick unless something true holds them in place, but her mouth stayed shut. "Lord, don't let me say the wrong thing." He stood, pacing once, the boards creaking under his weight. "Rule 3, you don't run." Ruth looked up, eyes red and raw. "I don't run. Everyone runs. I don't." Their gazes held, his steady, hers shaking. Hope coughed, small and pitiful. Ruth pressed the child closer. The man's eyes flicked to the sound and hardened. He turned away, rummaged through the saddlebag he'd thrown inside. Something metal clinked. She caught a glimpse of a shape wrapped in cloth, hard edges like a frame. He snapped the bag shut before she saw more. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Grant McCoy." She blinked. She knew that name. Not the stories, just the way people said it. 5 syllables spoken like a warning and a prayer tangled together. The wind slammed the window. Grant strode over and shoved the bolt until it groaned. "Rule 4, he said. "You never open this door unless you hear my voice." Ruth traced Hope's cheek with her thumb. "Your voice says what?" Grant paused. The fire cast a long red line across his jaw. "It doesn't matter what I say. You'll know it." Ruth wasn't sure whether that comforted her or frightened her. Maybe both. Grant dragged a second crate beside the stove, sat close enough for his coat to warm her shoulder. He didn't look at her, didn't soften. He simply stared into the blaze like a man studying judgment. "Storm will let up by morning," he said. "We ride then." Where? My place. Better than this. And the town? She asked. They'll smell trouble before we reach the gate. Ruth's breath hitched. Because of me. Because of me. He opened his hand, palm toward the fire. Old burn scars marked the skin, white against red. They hate what they don't own. Hope whimpered again. Grant shifted closer, cupping the child's head with a hand so gentle it didn't match the rest of him. Ruth watched, stunned, unsure how a man could hold a baby like that and speak as if made of stone. She'll live, he said. How do you know? I've buried enough to tell the difference. Ruth's heart dropped. The room tightened around her. She wanted to ask who he'd buried. She didn't. The question sat in her chest like a hot nail. Grant leaned back, eyes on the window. Snow kept slamming against the glass. They'll come, he murmured. For us? She asked. For you, for me. Doesn't matter which they choose first. Ruth breathed once, sharp and thin. I can't run again. Grant didn't look away from the storm, but his voice fell low, nearly human. Then don't. The fire cracked loud as if sealing the contract. Dawn broke slow, gray, and bitter. Grant lifted Ruth onto the horse before the light fully reached the snowfields. Hope was tucked against her chest, wrapped tight in Grant's coat. The child's breathing stayed thin, but steadier. Ruth kept her hand on that tiny rib cage the whole ride, counting each rise. Don't stop, don't stop! The storm had calmed, but cold settled deeper, a kind that got into bone. Grant didn't speak until the ranch appeared. A long stretch of fencing. A barn crouched under frost. The house standing straight but hollow against the winter hills. Don't stare, he warned quietly. They'll stare enough for you. She didn't understand until Jonas stepped out of the barn. His eyes hit Ruth first, then Hope, then Grant. Confusion tightened his jaw. Ruth felt everything in her twist. Grant didn't give explanations. Open the door, he said. Jonas obeyed. No questions. That told Ruth more about Grant's reputation than any story. Inside, warm air brushed her face. Not comfort, just heat trapped in a room that hadn't seen laughter or life in years. The walls were too clean, the table too bare, the silence too careful. Ruth hovered near the doorway, uncertain where to step. Grant set a log on the stove, lit it with quick, practiced strikes. Flames caught immediately. Come here, he told her. She walked toward him, boots dripping melt on the wooden floor. Hope whimpered softly, the sound bouncing off the tidy emptiness. Grant pointed to a narrow cot against the wall. Lay her down. Ruth obeyed, lowering the child onto a pile of folded blankets. She tucked them around her daughter, smoothing the frayed edges. Hope stirred once, then settled. Ruth exhaled, just barely. Thank you for another hour. When she turned, she caught sight of 2 plates on the shelf, one scuffed and worn, one nearly new. She stopped breathing for a beat. Grant noticed her looking. but didn't stop her from seeing. "Don't touch the white one," he said. "Whose was it?" He didn't answer. His silence was a gate slammed shut, heavy and final. Ruth lowered her eyes. Understood. He moved past her, checking windows, testing locks. His boots made no sound on the floorboards, as if he'd learned to walk like someone hunted once. "You'll work here," he said. "Cook, clean, whatever needs doing. You'll earn food, heat, roof. I'm not asking for more." "Good." She watched him close the back door, fingers lingering on the latch longer than necessary. Ruth recognized the gesture. The need to prove a barrier still held. Jonas entered then, hat in hand. "Boss, folks in town saw you riding late. Warren's men, too." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Let them wonder." Jonas glanced at Ruth again. "You sure?" Grant didn't turn. "I brought her here, didn't I?" "Yes, sir." Ruth straightened. "I'm not trouble. I won't cause—" "You already cause it by breathing," Grant said, voice flat. "That's not on you. Or maybe it is. Doesn't matter." He lifted the kettle, poured hot water into a tin cup, and handed it to her without looking. Ruth took it carefully. "Thank you," she said. "You'll thank me when winter ends," he replied. She almost laughed. It wasn't humor, not exactly. Something else, something like two broken edges matching for a second. Grant opened the pantry door. 3 sacks of flour. 2 jars of beans. Several missing that shouldn't be. His jaw tightened. "Jonas," he said, "count 5 sacks when you get a chance. Write it down." Jonas hesitated. "There were 5. There aren't any more." A chill worse than the wind slipped under Ruth's skin. Someone's been here. Someone wants him cornered. Grant closed the pantry slowly. Too slowly. "Lock every door," he said. "Double bar the barn tonight." "Yes, sir." Hope coughed. Ruth moved fast, lifting the child, tapping her back gently. Grant watched her, expression unreadable. "She'll need warm broth," he said. "I'll make it." "You'll make it right. Not thin, not weak." Ruth met his stare. "I know how to feed a child." Grant didn't apologize. He simply nodded once and stepped aside. Ruth carried Hope to the stove, warming her small hands over the flames. Grant stood a few paces away, arms crossed, eyes on the window as if expecting someone to appear there. In the quiet, the house felt like it was waiting, watching, holding its breath. Ruth broke the silence first. "This place feels empty." Grant didn't look at her. "It is." She wanted to ask who he'd lost, why the white plate stayed untouched, why the shadows in this house felt heavier than the storm outside. But she'd learned the West kept its wounds locked tight. So she whispered instead, to herself, too soft for him to hear, "So is mine." Grant's head turned slightly. Maybe he'd heard. Maybe he hadn't. But his voice, when it came, was low enough to count as mercy. Rest while she's warm, he said. Storm's clearing. Trouble isn't. The fire snapped once, sharp, final, and the house, empty no longer, shifted as if bracing for whoever would come next. Ruth rose before the sun, though she'd barely slept. Habit, not strength, lifted her. The house was cold, too cold for a place meant to hold memories. She wrapped Hope in an extra blanket and set her in a basket near the stove, tucking cloth around the tiny feet. The child stirred, but didn't cry. Ruth's breath ghosted white as she opened the pantry. 3 sacks, 2 jars, nothing more. She measured flour by instinct, tight measure, not wasteful, mixed a small dough, kneaded until her hands ached. She set it near the stove, close enough to rise, far enough not to burn. Grant stepped in from outside, shaking snow from his coat. His boots thudded once, then silence. "You're up early," he said. "Someone has to be," she answered. He didn't argue. His eyes drifted to the dough, to the kettle heating, to the child asleep in a basket beside the fire. A slow shift crossed his face, not softening, just noticing. He removed his gloves and hung them on a nail. Ruth kept working, sweeping ash from the stove's edge, wiping the counter with a rag dipped in warm water. The cloth turned gray, then black. She wrung it out, dipped again, scrubbed harder. The house responded the way starved things do, first with nothing, then with the faintest hint of life. Grant watched every motion. "You don't waste time." "No reason to." He walked past her, opened a cabinet, stared at the 2 plates again. The old one scratched, the white one untouched. Ruth pretended not to notice him hesitate. She lit a small lantern to brighten the corners. Light spilled across the room, across the table, the empty chair, the mantel with a thin coat of dust no one had bothered to wipe. She picked up a shawl that hung near the door. Soft wool, faded lavender. It smelled of cedar, old, kept, remembered. Ruth folded it and placed it neatly in a drawer, closing it gently so the memory inside wouldn't be disturbed. Grant stiffened at the sound. "Don't move that." Ruth paused. "It shouldn't hang there gathering dust." "Leave it anyway." She swallowed and obeyed. "There are things you don't touch." Hope coughed in her sleep. Ruth moved fast, lifting the child, rubbing small circles on her back until the sound calmed. Grant's eyes flicked toward her again, quick, controlled. "She needs broth," he said. "I'll make it when the dough's done." "Make it thick." "I know." He nodded once and stepped away, as if unsure why he'd said anything at all. Ruth took the chance to look at him when his back was turned, shoulders tense, jaw set. A man who lived on alert. A man who expected loss more than warmth. "I know that kind of man," she thought. "I've been that kind of woman." The dough rose just enough. She shaped it, set it on the iron pan, slid it into the stove. The smell, yeast mixing with heat, filled the house like a hymn. Something small loosened in her chest. Grant leaned a shoulder on the doorway, arms crossed. "Haven't smelled bread in this place for a long time." Bread keeps a house alive, she said without looking up. House hasn't been alive in years. Ruth met his eyes then. Then let it start. The words hung there, daring him to accept or reject what she'd just offered without offering. Before he could respond, Jonas appeared at the door, breath smoky in the cold. "Boss," he said, removing his hat. "Found this stuck to the gate." He held out a sheet of paper, edges wet from snow. Grant took it, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was jagged, angry. "Send the woman away." Ruth's stomach clenched. She didn't reach for hope. She didn't move at all. Grant fed the paper into the fire. Flames curled around the words, eating them whole. "You'll stay inside today," he said. Ruth nodded. "You'll keep doors locked." "I understand." Grant's eyes darkened. "They think fear makes people easier to move. And are they right? Not here." Ruth didn't know if he meant the ranch or her. She didn't ask. The bread finished baking. She pulled it from the stove, set it on the table, steam rising in soft curls. Grant looked at it like it was something fragile, something he didn't quite allow himself to want. Hope coughed again. Ruth tore a piece of bread, crumbled it into broth, stirred until it thickened. She fed her daughter slowly, carefully, every motion steady as prayer. Outside, a gust of wind hit the window hard enough to rattle the latch. Grant walked over, pressed his palm to the frame. "Storm's gone," he said. "But the town isn't." Ruth whispered a single thought under her breath, meant for no one but the God who watches wanderers. "Give me strength to stay this time." Grant glanced over his shoulder, as if he'd felt the words even if he hadn't heard them. And the house, little by little, breathed again. Afternoon light barely touched the ranch when hooves crunched across the yard. Ruth stiffened mid-stir, spoon hovering over the pot. Grant's jaw tightened before he even looked out the window. Reverend Silas rode up slow, posture straight as a fence post, coat black enough to drink the daylight. He dismounted without waiting to be invited. Men like him never waited. Grant stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a solid thud. Ruth stayed near the window, one finger lifting the curtain just an inch. Silas stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed not on Grant, but on the house, on her, on the child. Grant blocked his view with a single step. "Speak your piece," he said. Silas swept snow from his hat in one smooth motion. "I heard you brought someone home. You hear too much. Town talks. I listen." Silas's voice dropped to a solemn hush. "A man alone invites suspicion. A man alone with a woman of reputation invites ruin." Ruth's chest tightened. "Lord, I have no reputation worth ruining." Grant didn't flinch. "She and the child stay." "That is unwise given your history." Silas let the word hang. History. A knife without needing to be sharpened. Anna's memory deserves better judgment. Grant's shoulders locked. It was the smallest shift, but Ruth saw it even through the sliver of curtain. Silas continued, slow and deliberate. "I advise you to make the proper decision. Either send her away or marry her to keep talk from staining Anna's name. Grant stepped closer. My house, my rules. Silas smiled, thin and saintly. The Lord disciplines those he loves, Mr. McCoy. The town may do the same. He mounted his horse, flicked the reins, and rode away as though he'd just blessed the ground. Grant stood there a moment longer, breath fogging, shoulders rigid. He walked back in without a word. Ruth straightened, pretending she hadn't heard anything. Someone important? She asked lightly, though her voice wavered at the edges. No, Grant said, just loud. Hope whimpered. Ruth lifted her, swaying slightly to calm the small body trembling against her shoulder. But the day wasn't done crushing peace. Hooves thundered again, faster, sharper. A new horse, a new weight. Warren Kent appeared like a man arriving for a business meeting, not a confrontation. Coat clean, boots polished, smile wrong. He tipped his hat at Ruth as if greeting a client. Ma'am. Ruth didn't answer. She didn't owe him breath. Grant moved between them. State your business. Warren opened his leather folio, pulling out papers with crisp edges. A generous offer for your timber rights. More than fair, considering the season. I'm not selling. You haven't read the terms. I don't need to. Warren's smile widened. You know, keeping a woman like that here, people will assume things. Dangerous things. Things that make a man's land look vulnerable. Ruth felt the heat rise under her skin, not from shame, but from the violation of being spoken about, as if she weren't alive in the room. Grant's voice dropped low. Careful. Warren shrugged. Business, Grant. You know how it is. Wind shifts. Friends disappear. Credit dries up. I'd hate for you to suffer loss because you made an emotional decision. Grant took the paper, glanced over it, eyes narrowing at the length of the text. Ruth watched the muscles in his jaw work, reading slow, careful, like a man forcing himself to face something painful. He folded the paper once, twice, then tore it clean down the center. I'll manage my own loss, he said. Warren's eyes chilled. You will, sooner than you think. He rode off without looking back. Grant exhaled, sharp, controlled, but his hands trembled once before he hid them in his coat. Ruth spoke softly. They'll come again. They always do. Because of me. Because of me, Grant corrected. Town's been itching for a reason. Hope coughed, a thin, cutting sound. Ruth pressed her lips to the child's forehead. Warm. Too warm. Please, Lord. Not now. Grant saw her expression shift. He stepped close enough that the heat of the stove blurred between them. She's sick. She's fighting, Ruth whispered. They'll use that too. Ruth looked up at him. What do we do? Grant glanced toward the door Silas and Warren had just walked through. His voice was low. We keep the house standing. Outside, the wind picked up again, lifting snow in small spirals, like the land itself was drawing in a long, cold breath. Inside, Ruth held her child tighter. Grant moved to the window, watching the road. And the ranch, clean, silent, brittle, felt one step closer to cracking. Morning broke sharp as broken glass. Ruth stepped onto the porch with a bucket, breath clouding in the frozen air. The sky looked deceptively calm, flat, pale, merciless. She walked toward the well, boots crunching over old snow. The rope felt wrong the moment she touched it. Too smooth, too light. She pulled. The line snapped in her hands. The bucket fell with a hollow splash far below. Ruth staggered back, the frayed end of the rope swinging like a warning. Someone's been here. She scanned the yard, the tree line, the barn. No footprints except their own. Whoever had cut the rope had done it before the last snowfall. Behind her, the barn door slammed open. Jonas ran out, face tight, breath ragged. "Boss!" he shouted. Grant strode from the house, coat half-buttoned, gun belt slung across his hips. Ruth's heart already knew it before she heard the words. 2 carcasses, Jonas said. South fence, bullet holes, clean shots. Grant didn't curse. He didn't raise his voice. He just turned toward the south field and started walking. Each step controlled fury. Ruth followed without being told. The cold bit her skin, but dread warmed everything underneath. The cows lay stiff in the snow, red stains spreading like torn shadows. On the fence post between them was a nailed scrap of wood with crudely carved letters. "Send her or more die." Ruth's breath stuttered. Hope's fever had kept her awake half the night. She hadn't expected the day to start with death, too. Grant ripped the wooden threat off the post and stared at it hard enough to splinter it with his eyes alone. Jonas looked between them, jaw set. "What now, boss?" Grant didn't look at either of them. "We report it." "To Sheriff Briggs?" "Who else?" Grant said, voice dark. "Let him pretend the law still means something." They rode into town. Sheriff Briggs stood on the porch of his office, chewing on a matchstick, gaze scanning the street like he was counting sins. Ruth waited outside while Grant stepped in, Jonas close behind. Voices carried. Not loud, just sharp enough. "Shot clean," Grant said. "Someone sent a message." Briggs spat the matchstick into the dirt. "Town's nervous." "Town's violent." Briggs exhaled. "Folks think you brought trouble home." Ruth felt the words like a hand closing around her throat. Grant's voice dropped. "Folks should think again." Briggs met his gaze. A long, tired stare between 2 men who'd buried too much and trusted too little. "I'll check the prints," Briggs said. "But you know how this looks." Grant stepped back outside. His jaw was iron. "We're leaving." They rode home silent, the wind too cold for wasted breath. At the ranch, Ruth moved toward the well again. Grant caught her wrist. "Not you." "I can fix a rope." "You're not going down there." "It won't take long." "I said no." His grip loosened, but the command stayed. Ruth swallowed her, pride and nodded. Grant took the rope himself, tying a fresh length, checking knots twice. The cold turned his breath harsh. While he worked, Ruth walked toward the barn to fetch feed. She stopped dead. The barn door was cracked open. She hadn't left it that way. A single hoof print. Wrong direction, wrong depth. Pressed into the snow. Someone had been inside. Recently. Ruth's pulse thudded. She nudged the door wider with her boot. The barn lay still, quiet, dust moving faintly in the stray light like disturbed secrets. She stepped in. A tin bucket clanged behind her. Ruth spun, knife in hand, before thought caught up. No one. Just a bucket knocked over. Someone had tripped it on purpose. They want to see if we scare easy. Her chest tightened. I won't. I can't. She closed the barn door and slid the heavy bar into place. When she returned to the yard, Grant was coiling the repaired rope. His eyes flicked to her face once. What happened? Someone was inside the barn. Did you see them? No. Did they take anything? No, she said quietly. They wanted me to know they were there. Grant's jaw flexed. He holstered his gun without looking away from the horizon. They're testing fences, he said. Next time, they'll test us. Hope's cry drifted from the house then. Thin, trembling, sick. Ruth felt her knees weaken. Lord, not her too. She hurried inside. The child's forehead burned under her palm. Ruth rocked her gently, whispering prayers her mother used to speak over winter fevers. Grant stood in the doorway, watching both of them, snow still melting in his hair. Her breathing's worse, Ruth said. I see it. We need help. Town's help? He asked, voice flat. Look what town just did. Ruth held Hope closer, heart pounding in uneven beats. So what do we do? Grant didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the storm-burned sky, to the tree line, to the shredded scrap of wood he still held crushed in his fist. Then he spoke, low, certain, like the decision had been made long before either of them admitted fear out loud. We hold the line, he said, and if they want a war— He looked at Ruth, at Hope, at the fragile warmth struggling to stay alive in his house. They'll have to come through me first. The wind rattled the window like distant knuckles knocking. Somewhere inside Ruth, faith stirred, not comfort, but resolve. Let him stand, Lord. Let me stand too. Night fell fast, thick and heavy, the kind of dark that stole shapes off the earth. Ruth sat beside the bed, Hope in her arms, the child's breath rattling like a loose hinge. Fever glazed her small face. Snow clawed at the shutters. Grant moved through the house with the slow precision of a man counting sins. He checked windows, checked the door latch twice, then lit the second lamp and set it by the stove. The flame flickered weakly, fighting the drafts. Ruth wrung a cloth in cold water and pressed it to Hope's forehead. The baby didn't stir, not even a whimper. That silence cut deeper than any cry. She's burning, Ruth whispered. Grant crouched beside her, touching the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckles. He pulled away immediately, too hot. We need salicin drops, he said, From Briggs's old storeroom. That's in town, Ruth said, her voice barely held. Grant, you saw the field, the fence, the rope, they're waiting. He didn't deny it. He didn't need to. A gust slammed against the house, rattling the panes. Snow swept across the porch like a living thing. Ruth tightened her hold on Hope, trying to breathe steady, failing. She won't make it through the night like this, Grant said. The truth sat like a blade between them. Ruth's throat worked. Then I'll go. No. The word cracked like dry timber. Not you. Never you. Ruth felt something in her chest twist hard. Why does it always cost him? Why does it always cost me? Another wave of wind slammed the shutters. Grant rose, grabbed his coat, and reached for his gloves, then stopped when his fingers brushed the raw cuts along his knuckles from fixing the well. It's Christmas week, Ruth said suddenly. Her voice faltered, but the words pushed through anyway. God sees what you're about to do. Grant paused, jaw tense. Then he knows I'm doing it for the right reasons. Ruth swallowed. Or he knows you've already given enough. He looked at her over his shoulder. Not enough to save her. Hope wheezed softly, a sound too thin to belong to the living. That ended the argument. Grant buttoned his coat to the throat and strapped his holster tight. His movements were stiff, heavy, like he expected the world outside to hit back before he'd even stepped through the door. There's a password, he said. If I make it back. Ruth froze. Password? So you know it's me. He stepped closer. If someone knocks and doesn't say it, you don't open. Not for anyone. What do you want it to be? Grant glanced at the Bible on the table. Anna's Bible. Pages worn by a gentler hand. He tapped the cover. Grace holds. Ruth felt the words land in her chest like a stone and a promise all at once. She nodded. Grant leaned over Hope, just long enough to check her breathing again. His face didn't change, but something in his shoulders did, like the last piece of denial, slipping off a man who'd run out of time. Then he straightened and opened the door. The wind shoved in like a curse. Snow blasted across the floor. Ruth shielded Hope with her body. Grant stepped out into the storm, pulling the door shut behind him, and the house swallowed the echo of his boots like a final amen. When the latch clicked, the silence felt wrong. Hunted. Ruth barred the door, dragged a chair in front of it, then checked every window. The lamp flickered hard, almost dying. Hope's breath rasped on her shoulder. Outside, hooves shifted in the distance. Ruth's blood iced. She blew out the lamp so the house couldn't be read from the yard. Darkness folded around her, thick and close. She pressed her back to the wall, holding Hope against her chest, listening. A single hoofstep, then another. Slow. Deliberate. Too calm for a stray animal. Someone out there wanted her to hear him. Ruth's hand found the kitchen knife she'd tucked into her waistband earlier. Her fingers trembled. Not from fear, from calculation. If the door opens, move left. Hide the child behind the stove. Strike upward. The hoofsteps stopped. Silence stretched. Then a man's voice, low, almost gentle. "Ruth Winslow, open the door." Her blood froze. The way he said her name, too familiar, too certain. Whoever he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly who lived inside this house. Ruth didn't breathe. The voice came again, softer. "We just want to talk." Lies had a temperature. This one came cold enough to burn. She pulled Hope tighter and whispered into the child's hair, "Not tonight, little one. Not you." The door handle twitched. Once. Then let go. Hoofbeats retreated into the storm. Ruth stayed frozen long after they faded, every muscle locked. "Lord, watch the road. Watch his hands. Watch my breath." A prayer shaped more like a plea. At last, she moved, placing Hope in the basket by the stove. The child's breath rattled again. Ruth bit back a sound that threatened to break her. "I won't lose her," she whispered to the dark. "Not for them. Not for fear." She fed the fire with trembling hands. The flames rose weakly, then steadied. Ruth sat beside the heat, eyes on the door, knife still in hand. Outside, the storm screamed like a warning torn from heaven. Inside, Ruth whispered to herself, "Grace holds. Grace holds." But tonight, it sounded more like a question than a promise. Dawn didn't break. It leaked, thin and gray, through the frost on the windows. Ruth hadn't slept. She sat on the floor beside Hope's basket, rocking lightly each time the child's breath caught. The knife still lay within reach. The storm had passed, but the house hadn't loosened its fists around her ribs. Then 3 knocks, hard, measured, not the way the stranger called her name last night. Ruth froze. A breath. Then a voice, hoarse, scraped raw by cold. "Grace holds." Her knees buckled with relief before her mind caught up. She shoved the bar aside and yanked the door open. Grant stumbled through on the wind. Snow crusted his beard. Ice clung to his coat like scales. He held a small brown bottle tight against his chest, knuckles white. His eyes were barely open. Ruth reached for the bottle first, not him. That was instinct. Survival. Motherhood sharpened into a blade. 2 drops, Grant rasped. Every hour. He collapsed against the door frame. Ruth grabbed his arm to steady him and felt the wrongness instantly. His gloves were wet, too stiff. She pulled one off. The skin beneath was white, bone white, frostbitten to the nail beds, split in places where blood had frozen before it could fall. Ruth inhaled sharply. "Grant, what did you—" "Not important." He nodded toward the basket. "Give her the medicine." Hope whimpered, a thin cry like a torn thread. Ruth rushed to the bottle, pried the cork out with her teeth, and tilted 2 drops into the baby's mouth. Hope swallowed weakly. Ruth waited, counting breaths, until the rasp eased, even a little. Only then did her gaze return to Grant. He had sunk to the floor against the door, head bowed. His breath fogged unevenly, Snow melted on the boards beneath him. "You rode through that storm?" Ruth asked. He didn't lift his head. "Didn't have a choice. You could have died." Grant finally looked up. His eyes were rimmed red, unfocused. "She would have died for sure." The words struck her harder than the night wind. Ruth pulled another blanket over Hope, then crossed the room and knelt in front of him. She didn't speak. Words softened things that shouldn't be soft. Instead, she reached for his other glove. "Don't," he muttered. Ruth stripped it anyway. The skin underneath was worse. Gray where it should have been red. Blistered. Cracked along the knuckles, as if the storm had tried to peel him apart. For the first time since she'd met him, Grant flinched from touch. "I shouldn't have opened that door." The thought came uninvited, sharp as guilt. Ruth ignored it. She fetched warm water, cloth, and the jar of salve she'd saved from before the mines. She set them beside him and said, "Give me your hands." He hesitated, not from pride, from pain. Ruth reached anyway. As she worked, Grant looked everywhere except her face. The fire crackled softly, throwing thin light across the room. "Jonas see anything?" Grant murmured. "No," Ruth said. "But someone was near the house. They called me by name." Grant's jaw tightened. "Warren's men." "Or someone else." Ruth squeezed his palm lightly, checking sensation. "This ranch is being watched." Grant's brow creased. Anger or shame or both. "Should have been here. You were getting medicine. That doesn't undo the danger I left you in." Ruth didn't answer. She wrapped each finger carefully, binding life back into his hands. Silence carried the weight instead. When she finished, Grant flexed experimentally and winced. "You won't be able to chop wood for days," she said flatly. "Then I'll use my shoulder." "Grant." Her voice cut through his stubbornness. "You can't protect this place with broken hands." He looked at her then, really looked. And something in his eyes shifted, as if the house, the child, the woman kneeling in front of him had become heavier than the land he'd been trying to hold alone. "I'll manage," he said. Ruth's jaw tightened. "You don't have to manage. You have help." Grant blinked, slowly, as if the idea had never occurred to him. Hope coughed. Weak, but clearer. Ruth glanced back and her breath eased for the first time all night. "She's coming back," Ruth whispered. Grant lowered his head. "Good." A beat passed. Then 3 more knocks at the door. Soft. Too soft. Ruth stiffened instantly. Grant reached for his gun, but his fingers wouldn't close around the grip. "Who is it?" Ruth called, knife already in hand. A pause. Then a voice she didn't expect. "Sheriff Briggs. Need a word." Ruth shot Grant a look. He pushed himself upright with his elbows, teeth clenched against the pain. The sheriff spoke again, voice low through the wood. "Someone reported trouble at your line shack, and Warren's in town saying you're harboring a criminal." Ruth's pulse stilled. Grant exhaled. "It begins." Ruth whispered, too soft for the sheriff to hear. Lord, stand between us and whatever's coming. She rose, squared her shoulders, and set her hand on the bar of the door. Sheriff Briggs stepped inside only far enough to shut out the wind, leaving his boots on the edge of the mat, as if crossing that line meant taking sides. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Hope first. The baby's breaths were shallow but steadier. Then he looked at Grant's bandaged hands. "This happened on the ride?" Briggs asked. Grant didn't answer. Silence was safer than truth. Briggs rubbed his jaw. "Warren's stirring up smoke. Says you brought a troublemaker here. Says the town ought to reconsider your standing." Ruth's grip tightened around the knife she hadn't yet put away. "I kept to myself. I hurt no one." Briggs held up a hand. "I'm not saying you did. I'm saying Warren's ready to make folks believe you did." Grant rose unsteadily, using his forearm against the wall to push upright. "What does he want?" "Same as always," Briggs said. "Your timber rights, and something to blame." He paused. "Man like that doesn't waste a rumor unless he's already set the stage." Ruth felt the weight settle. Cold, heavy. They were coming, whether she breathed wrong or didn't breathe at all. Briggs lowered his voice. "He rode into the church this morning. Silas listened. Folks listened to Silas." Grant's jaw tightened. "Of course they did." "Town thinks you've taken in a cursed woman," Briggs said, eyes flicking to Ruth with something like regret. "They think misfortune follows her." Ruth didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in mines, in camps, in alleys where men threw stones before they threw mercy. Pain didn't surprise her anymore. What surprised her was the way Grant looked at her, like the accusation had landed on him instead. Briggs stepped back toward the door. "I'm warning you because I owed your father that much. Be ready. They'll come by sundown." "Why?" Grant asked. Briggs hesitated. "To make you choose." A knock cut him off. Not his knock. Harder, confident, several hands at once. Ruth froze. "Lord, give me breath." Briggs opened the door, and the cold spilled in with 4 silhouettes behind him. Warren Kent stood at the front, gloved, smug, smelling faintly of cigar smoke that didn't belong in winter morning air. Reverend Silas beside him, black coat buttoned to the throat, Bible tucked under one arm. 2 town men lingering behind like shadows waiting for command. Warren smiled at the room as if admiring a painting he planned to replace. "Well," he said lightly, "seems the rumors had some truth." Grant moved instinctively between Ruth and the men. His bandaged hands hung useless at his sides, but his stance said fight anyway. Briggs stepped aside. He wasn't here to back Warren, but this was town business, and he wouldn't interfere unless the law demanded it. Warren removed his gloves with an elegance that felt rehearsed. "We've come for a simple answer, McCoy." Silas stepped forward, voice warm and poisonous. "This house holds memory. Anna's memory. A righteous man honors that." He nodded toward Ruth. "This situation is a stain the town can't ignore." Ruth felt something twist in her gut. Not from shame. She'd run out of shame years ago, but from the cruelty of how gently he said it. Grant said nothing. Silas turned, letting the silence convict her. She brings misfortune wherever she goes. Ruth stared back, steady. Misfortune was here long before I arrived. Warren's smile thinned. The town wants her gone, before more lines are crossed. Grant inhaled to speak, but the moment his eyes flicked to the shawl hanging by the stairs, Anna's shawl, the words collapsed in his throat. Ruth saw it, felt it. He can't choose me over a ghost. Not with the town watching. Not with those hands broken for her child. Warren sensed the fracture and pressed his heel. So what's it going to be, McCoy? Keep her, or keep your name? Ruth stepped forward before Grant could fail again. I'll go. Grant's head snapped toward her. No. Yes. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it sounded too calm. The kind of calm that comes after you've bled every fear dry. If my being here brings danger, then I'll leave before nightfall. Hope gave a soft cry behind her, thin, pleading. Ruth didn't turn around. Turning would break her. Grant took a step toward her, hands useless, eyes full of something raw. Fear, guilt, the ghosts he kept buried under work and silence. Ruth, you saved her life, she said softly. You owe me nothing more. Warren looked satisfied. Silas looked vindicated. Briggs looked tired. Ruth walked to the table, gathered Hope in her arms, wrapped the child in the patched blanket, and reached for the small cloth bag she'd kept ready since the mines, a habit learned from never belonging anywhere. She didn't take food, didn't take a coat, didn't take anything that wasn't hers. She faced Grant one last time, her eyes steady and unbearably kind. You stood for us as far as you could, she said. That's more than most men ever gave. Grant shook his head, breath breaking. Don't do this. Ruth swallowed once hard. I won't be the reason they break your home. Then she walked past Warren, past Silas, past Briggs, carrying her child into the cold. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt like judgment. And inside that house, Grant McCoy stood unmoving, his breath shaking in the still air. Lord, forgive me, he thought, though he couldn't tell if he meant for letting her go or for wanting to run after her. The house stayed still long after Ruth's footsteps faded into the snow. Too still, as if the walls themselves were ashamed. Grant didn't move. Not when Warren smirked and left, not when Silas murmured some polished scripture about order. Not even when Briggs paused in the doorway and said quietly, You don't have to choose their way, Grant. Grant didn't answer, because he already had. Cowardice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it sounded like silence, like the breath he never took when Ruth waited for him to speak. Not again, he thought, and the words scraped like gravel down his throat. When the last horse left the yard, Grant finally turned toward the table. Hope's basket sat empty, blanket rumpled. Ruth's chair pushed back slightly from where she'd stood. A single hair ribbon lay on the floor, blue as a bruise. He picked it up with both bandaged hands, The pain was immediate, sharp enough to blind him for a second. He welcomed it. Pain proved he was still alive enough to fix what he'd broken. Grant straightened with effort. "Jonas!" he barked. Jonas appeared instantly in the doorway, face pale. "Sir, what do you need?" "Saddle my horse." Jonas looked at his hands. "Sir, you can't ride in that condition." Grant stepped into his coat. "I won't lose them." Jonas hesitated, then nodded once and ran. Grant grabbed a blanket, a flask of broth, and the thick wool scarf Ruth had washed 2 nights ago. It still smelled faintly of lye and pine. He shoved it into his coat, breath shaking. Outside, the wind had softened, but the cold bit hard and deep. Tracks stretched across the yard, small, light, desperate. Ruth had walked fast, even carrying the child, trying to get far enough that when the town congratulated itself for driving her out, she wouldn't hear them. Grant mounted with difficulty. His hands couldn't grip the reins properly. He looped them around his wrists instead. "Lord," he muttered, "don't let me be too late again. Don't let the snow cover her tracks like you covered mine." He spurred the horse. The trail wound through the pines, down the ridge, across the low creek bed glazed with ice. Ruth's footprints staggered near the water. She'd slipped. The baby's prints showed where Ruth had knelt to adjust the blanket. Grant's chest tightened. "Keep moving, Ruth. Just a little longer." He followed the trail another half-mile until he spotted a shape under a bare cottonwood tree. A dark bundle curved over itself, still as stone. Grant dismounted before the horse stopped. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He dropped to his knees. "Ruth." She lifted her head slowly. Her lips were numb, skin pale, eyes glazed with cold. Hope lay against her chest, wrapped tight in the patched blanket. "She needs warmth," Ruth whispered. "That's all that matters." Her voice cracked on the last word. Grant pulled off his coat and wrapped it around both of them. Then he lifted mother and child into his arms, grunting at the flare of pain in his hands. Ruth clutched Hope tighter but didn't resist him. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured. "I should have never let you leave," he replied. "I should have stood. I should have spoken. I should have damned the town to its own judgment." The thoughts hammered him. He didn't say them aloud. Shame was quieter than pride. He carried them to the horse, mounted with Ruth in front of him and the baby sandwiched safely between. Ruth leaned back against his chest, not trusting him, just trying not to fall. Snow stung their faces as he guided the horse home. Inside the ranch house, heat hit them like mercy. Grant set Ruth on the bench by the hearth and took Hope gently from her arms. His hands trembled too much to unbutton the blanket, but Ruth did it for him. Hope let out a weak cry, a good sign, a living sign. Grant swallowed, throat tight. Ruth reached for the flask of broth he had brought. She held it to Hope's lips, coaxing tiny sips. Grant watched the child's throat move, watched her breath steady. "Ruth," he said quietly, "I'm not letting you run again." "You can't shield us from the whole town," she whispered. I don't plan to. He pulled something from inside his coat, her oil-wrapped letter, the secret she'd been carrying like a blade. I know what this is, he said, and I know what it means. Ruth stiffened. Grant, listen. If you show that to them, Warren will start a war you can't win. Grant stepped closer. He already started it. I'm just done pretending he didn't. His voice was steady now, finally steady. Ruth looked at him as if seeing a different man than the one who stood silent on the porch. Grant set the letter on the table like a stake driven into ground. Tomorrow, he said, we go into town together. Together, she repeated softly. Yes. His breath fogged faintly in the warm air. I won't let them speak for me, or for you. A beat. I'm done hiding behind ghosts. Ruth's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something raw, recognition, or maybe disbelief. Outside, wind rattled the shutters one last time before dying down. Inside, hope breathed easier, and Grant whispered, not quite a prayer, not quite a promise. Lord, stand with us because I will stand this time. They rode into town at midday, when the street was fullest and judgment weighed heaviest. Grant held the reins looped around his bandaged wrists, Ruth sitting straight behind him, with hope secured in a shawl across her chest. Snow still clung to the eaves. The cold stung like truth. People stopped what they were doing. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. It felt like walking into a verdict already written. Grant dismounted stiffly and tied the horse to the hitching post in front of Harper's General Store, a place where men argued politics, religion, and whoever's failure was entertaining that week. Today, that failure was his. Ruth slid down carefully, protecting hope from the wind. Grant stepped in front of them, not out of ownership, but out of instinct. Out of fear, he'd lost the right to protect them at all. Lord, don't let me break again. Warren Kent walked out of the store as if summoned. Silas followed, Bible tucked under one arm like a gavel waiting to fall. Sheriff Briggs came too, eyes narrowed, jaw grim. A crowd formed fast. Warren spread his arms. Well now, the prodigal returns. Silas's voice floated like frostbite. Grant McCoy, and the woman he shelters from righteousness. Ruth felt the words ripple through the crowd. Cursed, cursed, cursed. Grant didn't react. He reached into his coat with both shaking hands and pulled out Anna's Bible. The crowd murmured. Silas stiffened. You think waving scripture will undo sin? Grant opened the Bible to a page marked with a torn ribbon. No, he said. I think reading it will. He stepped into the center of the square. Ruth held her breath. Briggs moved to the sideline, clearing space. Martha Doyle, leaning on her cane, edged closer too. Grant looked at Ruth once. Just once. She nodded. He began to read. His voice was rough, unsteady. The cold made it worse. The scars on his knuckles made the page tremble in his hands. For I desired mercy. He stopped. He'd lost the next word. People shifted, hungry for him to fail. Ruth stepped forward, not touching him, not prompting, just placing her hand lightly near the page, her finger pointing to the next line. A guide, not a savior. Grant inhaled. And not sacrifice. The murmuring changed tone, confusion, unease. Silas cut in, voice sharp. You quote half a verse and call it truth? Grant lifted his head. I'm quoting the part you never do. A ripple ran through the crowd. He continued, slower but stronger. I will have mercy and not judgment. For with the same measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. Warren laughed once, short and brittle. You think a few lines will wipe her record clean? Grant closed the Bible. No, he said, but it wipes yours. Silas's face went pale. Grant turned, addressing everyone. Farmers, mothers, ranch hands, clerks, children half hidden behind skirts. All of them had watched him break yesterday. All of them expected to see him bow again. I was wrong yesterday, he said. I kept silent. That silence nearly cost a mother and her child their lives. The crowd leaned in. Grant's breath fogged in the air, trembling but fierce. I won't let fear decide my house again. Ruth stays under my roof, under my name, and anyone who comes for her comes for me. Someone in the crowd scoffed. Another cursed under breath. But others shifted, uncomfortable, unsure. Then Ruth stepped forward. She didn't speak. She didn't need words. She simply pulled the blanket away from Hope's face, revealing the child's gaunt cheeks, the red-rimmed nose, the way she clung to Ruth's shirt. A sound went through the crowd, sharp, collective. Pity slipped past prejudice before they could stop it. Martha Doyle struck her cane on the ground. Which one of you, she said loudly, hasn't needed grace when you least deserved it? Silence. Her old voice cracked with the force of years and loss. Town talks about God like he's yours alone, yet you let a babe near freeze outside a church last week. Faces reddened, shoulders sagged, eyes broke away. Mary Collins, a young mother near the bakery, stepped forward. I saw her that night, she whispered. She tried to buy milk with a button. Nobody helped. A man beside her muttered, We didn't know. You didn't ask, Mary replied. Sheriff Briggs finally sighed, removing his hat. There's no law says she can't stay, and no law says Grant can't decide who stands on his land. Warren's jaw clenched. This isn't about law. This is about order. No, Briggs said quietly. This is about fear, and I'm tired of enforcing fear. Silas opened his Bible, but the moment he did, Grant opened Anna's again, mirroring him. The crowd caught the symbolism instantly. 2 books, 1 truth. Silas closed his first. Grant lifted his chin. We're done running. If you have something to say about it, say it now. No one did. Not even Warren. The wind eased. Snow drifted lazily instead of cutting sideways. For the first time in years, Grant felt the square go still for him. not against him. Ruth looked at him then, not grateful, not fragile, just certain, as if she'd known this version of him existed long before he found it himself. Hope stirred softly, a warm, living sound. Grant exhaled. "Thank you," he whispered inside, "for helping me stand." The wedding happened at dawn, the coldest part of the day. No flowers, no music, just breath fogging in the empty church and Silas standing stiff behind the pulpit, reading the vows as if they weighed more than Scripture itself. Ruth held Hope close, the child bundled in the patched blanket. Grant stood beside them, hands still bandaged, shoulders squared against the draft sweeping through the cracks in the old wood walls. Silas cleared his throat. "Do you, Grant McCoy?" "I do," Grant said before the question finished. Ruth's eyes flickered, surprise, then something steadier. Silas turned to her. "And do you, Ruth Winslow?" "I do," she said quietly. Not timid, certain. When it was done, Silas closed the Bible with a soft thud that sounded like disapproval disguised as ritual. Briggs signed the ledger. Martha Doyle dabbed her eyes with her sleeve. Mary Collins slipped a tiny knitted cap into Ruth's hand, whispering, "For the baby." Grant lifted Hope gently, and the child made a soft, cooing sound, her first warm morning sound in days. Ruth looked at Grant. He looked at them both. The world outside the church could rot for all he cared. They rode home slow. Snow glistened on the fence rails like silver laid out for a feast. The ranch didn't look different, but it felt different, like walls that had waited too long to breathe finally exhaled. Inside, Ruth placed Hope in the cradle near the stove. Grant set a third plate on the table, small, tin, dented, and didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Ruth's breath caught anyway. "Family ought to eat together," he said. Simple. Clean. True. She folded her shawl and laid it in Anna's cedar chest. Not thrown away. Not displayed. Just laid to rest. Grant walked over and closed the lid slowly, reverently. A benediction for a life that had shaped him. A boundary for the one he was stepping into. The fire crackled. Ruth simmered broth. Grant repaired the loose hinge on the back door, wincing at the strain on his hands. Ruth wrapped them again without comment. Normal things. Quiet things. But for two people who had lived their lives running, quiet was its own miracle. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again. Clouds gathered low and heavy. Grant noticed the rider first, a black shape lingering at the far edge of the property, just beyond the line of cottonwoods. He stiffened. "Warren." Ruth moved to the window. The rider didn't approach, didn't turn, just watched. Waiting. "Why come back so soon?" she asked. Grant's jaw tightened. Because he didn't get what he wanted today. He walked to the table, pulled out the envelope Ruth had given him days ago, the one wrapped in oilcloth, the one that held the truth about the mine collapse. He set it in the center of the table like a map before a battle. Ruth stood across from him, fingers tracing the cracked wax seal. "If this goes public, he'll come harder," she said. "He already is," Grant answered. A heavy knock shook the door before she could reply. Not violent. Official. Briggs stood outside, hat low, papers in his hand. "Grant," he said, "Banks filed for a reevaluation of your timber rights. Warren's pushing it. Means they'll come for your land on ledger before they ever try on horseback." Grant looked past him to the rider still waiting at the tree line. "So it begins," he murmured. Briggs lowered his voice. "If you've got anything that proves misconduct, you bring it tomorrow, quiet-like, or this place won't survive the winter." He glanced at Ruth and Hope, expression softening. "Neither will they." Ruth closed her hand around the envelope. "We'll be there." Briggs hesitated, then tipped his hat and rode off. Grant shut the door. For a moment the house held its breath. Hope stirred in the cradle, letting out a small sigh, content, unaware, alive. Ruth bent to adjust her blanket. Grant watched her hands, gentle and sure. He looked around the room at the plates, the fire, the cradle, the chest. At everything he had nearly lost because he'd let fear speak louder than truth. Not anymore. He stepped closer to Ruth, close enough that the words came low, steady, almost like prayer. "We stand together tomorrow." Ruth nodded. "Together." Grant brushed one bandaged hand against her sleeve. Not a touch of possession, but of vow. Outside, wind shifted through the pines. The rider at the tree line finally turned his horse and disappeared into the dusk. But he'd be back. Warren wasn't done. Neither were they. "Lord, give us the spine to face what comes," Grant thought. Inside that small house on the wintering prairie, 3 lives breathed the same warm air. And for the first time in years, Grant McCoy felt the weight of battle ahead and the worth of what he would fight for.